Good morning, everybody. I'm Barry Lynn, and I'm the executive director of the Open Markets Institute. And welcome. It's great to see so many friends and allies. You know, our goal today is nothing short of starting the renewal of the American Democratic Republic. And we're going to do it by learning how anti monopoly can empower us to do so. Our most immediate goal is to launch the second stage of the anti-monopoly movement, or rather, this movement to build a true democracy in America. 6 years ago, Senator Warren kicked off the first stage of the movement with a speech at the Capitol, which we also hosted. Many of you in the room today were there. 6 years ago, as you'll remember, the idea that America faced a monopoly crisis shocked many people. That cannot be, folks said. America is the land of cowboy capitalism, the land of the radically free market, and the free market naturally breaks all power. Well, since then, we've learned the exact opposite is true, and that just about every ill we face today is caused by or made worse by monopolization, soaring prices for our homes, our food, our health care, our drugs, ever lower wages and ever worse jobs, surveillance and restrictions on our movement, the starving of the free press, the spread of misinformation and propaganda, the manipulation and disruption of democratic debate, deadly shortages, even of face masks and baby formula, the potential for catastrophic breakdowns of the industrial systems on which we depend for our most basic vital goods, ever bigger barriers to true global decarbonization. Every one of these is due entirely or largely to monopolization. Since that day 6 years ago, we have built a movement. You in this room have built a movement. Back then, it was hard to find 10 people to put on stage. Now there are dozens of groups, dozens of allies and friends. There's thousands of people playing an active leading role in this effort. Millions more around the world learning. Since then, together, we have won amazing victories that were hard to imagine in that room 6 years ago. In enforcement, consider the DOJ's revolutionary case against Google just a couple of weeks back. The FTC's transformative action on non-competes earlier this year, the DOJ's efforts to protect freedom in the American book publishing, successful effort with a successful case that created a new legal tool in the form of an enforceable anti-monopsony law. So too in Congress. Here too we have huge wins. Yes, we were all disappointed by the failure last year to call a vote on ICOA. But let's be clear, that story is not finished yet. And let's also recognize what Congress did do in the IRA and the CHIPS Act, which was to use money, subsidies, and rules to break choke points. These bills, properly understood, are also anti-monopoly bills, hugely important anti-monopoly victories. And then there's Europe. We're a growing league of visionaries, true visionaries, including Andreas Mundt, who's the head of the German Anti-Monopoly Office, Stephanie Jan Cartan, Reinhard Bütikofer, Andreas Schwab, Paul Tang, and many others in the European Parliament, Thierry Breton, the Commission, and also for the first time where we see a rising civil society movement against monopoly. And then we have President Biden. Not only did he appoint Lena Khan and Jonathan Cantor, but he signed an executive order that transformed how we use all of our government to fight monopoly. Most important, President Biden is driving a true intellectual revolution. Neoliberalism, he said in his executive order, Borkism, is a failed experiment. The purpose of anti-monopoly, the president said, is not efficiency, it is democracy. It is human liberty. A true intellectual revolution is taking place here in America today. But as you all know, most of the job remains ahead. In many sectors, power is far more concentrated than 6 years ago. Control is tighter. The monopolist's ability to manipulate public debate, to manipulate much of Congress, to impose fear even on the biggest corporations, including some of our newspapers, has only grown. And we, as a movement, we still have some to learn. Most importantly, we still need to learn more about how to use non-discrimination law and rules, which are the foundations of all democracy and anti-monopoly. I know something about the structures of economic power. My dad grew up picking strawberries on a sharecrop farm outside of Plant City, Florida. He first went into the fields when he was 6 years old. He worked from sunup until way past sundown. He picked strawberries until he joined the Navy when he was 17. Thanks to smart, fair, traditional government programs based on principles established at the founding of our country, my parents were able to provide a middle-class life for my brother and me for a while. Then my mom got sick, and my dad lost his job, and our family was suddenly kind of poor. We still had a roof, and we had food, but not much else. And there's a reason I bring this up. And the reason is the one big thing I learned from my dad and from our neighbors where I grew up on the backside of Miami, and from so many of the people I talk to today, is that folks don't really care about the mansions of the rich or the private jets of the rich or any of that stuff. Let them keep that. What ticks us off is when they use their corporations, their monopolies, their systems of surveillance and manipulation to pick our pockets, to put a fist in our face, to sick our neighbors against us, to manipulate us and control us and govern us and prevent us from using all the gifts that God gave us to do for ourselves, in our families, in our communities, in our society, in our world, as only we know how. We have a terrific day lined up for you today. By the end of today, I hope all of us here, will see that anti-monopoly is not merely a way to break power, it's also a way to free our souls and our imaginations, a way to free ourselves to make and build and create a far stronger and more inclusive democracy, a more true human liberty, a safer, more peaceful, and more sustainable world. I have a few important thank yous to make. First is to the Financial Times for co-sponsoring today's event. Not with money. We at Open Markets do not take money from any corporation. It is a really great honor to have the Financial Times with us here today. I also want to thank Color of Change and Public Citizen, our leading co-sponsors for Senator Warren's speech. This, too, is a real honor for us. When Open Markets first became independent 5 years ago, Color of Change and Public Citizen were among the very first to rally behind us. We have many other close friends and allies with us today in person and in spirit. ILSR, Farm Action, Demand Progress, Fight for the Future, the Balanced Economy Project, AFR, Revolving Door, News Media Alliance, the Authors Guild, Groundwork, AELP, Free Press, Public Knowledge, many, many others, and I'm sorry for those I leave off this list. It is great to have you all. A bit of housekeeping. We'll be serving lunch around 12:30. The bathrooms, there are lots of signs out there. You can find them. Obviously, please keep your phones on vibrate. And we are live streaming the event today, and we're going to have a video up quite soon. Finally, some words about our next speaker. my co-host, my dear friend, Rana Foroohar. For those of you who don't know the basics, Rana is the Financial Times global business columnist. She is also the author of 3 very important books, Makers and Takers, Don't Be Evil, and the brand new Homecoming, a really terrific vision of what can be. But those sorts of details don't really begin to capture Rana, the Rana that I know. Rana is one of the few writers in American journalism today who really understands power. Better yet, who really knows how to explain the challenges posed by power, the challenges of mastering power, and where we can go once we do. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I'm Rana Foroohar. I'm the global business columnist for the Financial Times, and I'm delighted to be here as a co-host for this Open Markets event. And thank you to Barry for the incredibly kind words. I would just say right back at you, Barry. Barry is one of these people, and I just have to say a few personal words before I launch into my big picture. He's one of these people that, for me, as a journalist, as a thinker, has been a kind of a rabbi over the last 20 years, someone that I would touch base with on big picture topics and say, hey, what's really going on here? And he's the kind of person that can, with both data, but also felt experience, really decode what's happening in the world and in the economy right now. And I think that the movement, truly the movement that he has built with open markets, which has been so influential in ways that we can see and in some ways that are powerfully behind the scenes, has just been incredible to be a part of. So thank you to Barry, and thanks everybody for being here. I want to, in the next 10 minutes or so, before we hear from Senator Warren, just kind of put the anti-monopoly movement and what open markets has so successfully done in the context of what I think is a broader, once-in-a-lifetime change that we are going through in the global economy and in this country. If I had to kind of sum up what the big picture here is, I would say the world is not flat. And that is clearly a reference not to geography, but to the Tom Friedman book from 2005 that basically posited a world in which capital, goods, and people were all going to be able to travel seamlessly and equally across borders and end up where it was most productive for them to do so. Now, those of us who were really scratching our heads a little bit about this were also reading Barry's book that came out in 2006, The End of the Line. And if you haven't read it, go out and get it, because it's still the best book ever written on global supply chains, and it will explain this moment to you. But to go back to this sort of neoliberal idea of the world is flat, and the notion that capital, goods, and people are all on an equal playing field, there was always a flaw in that thesis, which is that capital could travel much faster and much further than either goods and certainly than people. And so what that did, in simple terms, was to create a lot of wealth at a global level, but increased inequality in almost every country. And that, to me, is essentially the simple fact that explains where we are economically today and where we are politically today, not just in this country, but in many countries around the world. So that is the core fact here. Now, we can talk a lot about metrics, about economic data, about cycles. But like Barry, I want to maybe just share one important experience, a felt experience. When I was reporting my third book, Homecoming, which lays out the foundations of what I think will be the post-neoliberal era, I had an interesting interview before he passed away with the former AFL-CIO leader, Richard Trumka, wonderful man. And I was asking him about some of the conversations around financial deregulation and around trade policy that were happening in the 90s. And I said, what were the conversations about how that was going to affect labor, how that was going to affect actual real people on the ground in Main Street America? And he says he remembers one policymaker at the time coming to him and saying, you know, don't worry, we know as the US globalizes, as big companies expand, there's going to be some inequality, labor's going to get hit, but don't worry, it's all going to work out in the end. And he said, well, how long is that going to take? And the policymaker said, 3 to 5 generations. Okay, so if anybody wonders about economists and whether data and the real economy and the political economy can actually be crunched in an algorithm, just remember that. So we're now, the good news I would say is that we're at a change point. I think we're at a truly a once in a lifetime change point. And why do I say that? Because all the things that built the foundations of the old world are going away. And I would point to three things. It's all about cheap. Cheap capital, cheap labor, and cheap energy. All those things are going away. Let's start with cheap capital. We have had 40 years, roughly, of low and falling interest rates. That's allowed a lot of things. One of the things that it's done is allow companies to take on huge amounts of debt, grow bigger, give that money back in the form of buybacks to the largest companies and also to the top 10% of the population that controls 85% of equity wealth. That's now ending. Whether we like it or not, we're going through a monetary policy pivot point, not just in the US, but elsewhere. So that cheap capital, much of which was flowing from US companies into cheap labor locations, is going away. Cheap labor. Thank you. Thanks, Sarah Nelson. I see you clapping. I'm going to clap too. Also, cheap labor going away for a lot of reasons. And I want to get to a topic that I think is often misconstrued in the media, which is the US-China relationship. And you might call it a conflicted relationship. There's a trade war, there's a Cold War. You can call it what you will. But if you go way back to 2015 and look at China's own policy, which was the Made in China 2025 policy, the Chinese were saying, hey, we're now a richer nation. We're both a consuming and a producing nation, and we want to have more of our supply chains at home. We want to have more of what they call a dual circulation economy for good reasons. It's better for energy. It's better for carbon emissions. It makes more sense to raise up and make that leap to the middle class that the Chinese are trying to make. So this change in the cheap capital for cheap labor bargain is happening in a global context. And it's not about any single administration. It's a broadening and a sort of a regionalizing and localizing of labor, which I think is going to be a healthy thing going forward. And that's also happening in the US because, of course, with a lot of the moves that the administration has made, most particularly the Inflation Reduction Act, we're going to finally, I think, start to see some carrots and some sticks for companies that are doing the right thing for people and for the environment. And that's a great thing. And that, again, is going to favor well-trained labor, better paid labor. So we're entering a new era. Finally, cheap energy. Russia's war in Ukraine, I think, has put an end to the fallacy that you can simply get your energy from anywhere, that you can buy cheap gas from an oligarch and it's all going to be fine in the end. It will not be fine. The world is not flat. The world is bumpy. Now, it's going to get bumpier, I think, in the short term, but the good news is that we are going to a better place. I mean, we can see it already, just looking at so many of the moves of this administration over the last couple of years. Barry mentioned a couple of them, the executive order, Biden's work not wealth philosophy, the appointments of great people at the FTC, DOJ, in the White House. So I am really optimistic, actually, that we are just beginning to be at a narrative pivot point. And I think people will go back in history and look at this moment and look at certainly the work of groups like Open Markets and Barry and say, this is when change happened. So we're there. I'm so pleased to be here with you. I'm pleased to help narrate this conversation over the next afternoon, day, and I hope that we'll all stay in touch. And now I'm going to turn it over to Barry so that he can introduce Senator Warren.